Hello and welcome to episode 41 of Linux Downtime. I'm Joe, and with me is Adam Pigg. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Nice to be here, Joe.
So, you are the go-to person in the community when it comes to Sailfish OS. That is a Linux-based operating system for phones that is not Android, and it's not Ubuntu Touch. It's its own thing.
Well, I think the go-to person's a bit of a stretch, but yeah, for sure.
Well, certainly within the sort of Late Night Linux and other Linux podcast community, you tend to hang around the Telegram groups advocating for Sailfish, shall we say.
Yeah.
So let's start with exactly what it is then, and I suppose deal with the elephant in the room. It's not 100% open source, even though it is Linux-based.
Yeah, so it's a Linux-based operating system developed by Yola. Most of it is open source, but the user interface and GUI library is closed source, and there's some additional closed source parts like the Android compatibility layer, the text prediction, and Exchange support.
So all of the really good stuff then is proprietary?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is the good stuff, but the community does do quite a good job of recreating those parts. So there's really good text prediction, and lately there's also Waydroid support, which fills in the gap for Android apps. So
there's Nemo Mobile, which is an open source version of Sailfish OS. Are you involved with that at all?
Not particularly, apart from we kind of hang around in the same channel. So we chat, the developers all chat together and share ideas and share configurations and patches and things. But I don't do anything with Nemo itself. Okay, fair enough. Because Sailfish to me is the best of the alternative mobile operating systems that I've ever tried. And I've tried them all. And, you know, they all have their merits and everything. But Sailfish seems like the most complete. Presumably that's what attracted you to it in the first place. Yeah, I mean, what attracted me was wanting something different to Android and iOS. And I'd used the precursors to Sailfish, which were from Nokia back in 2010. Yeah, about 2010. And then I got into Sailfish about a little bit later, about 2014-15, when I started porting it to my own devices.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. You linked me to a thread with some details about that. You basically just bought yourself a cheap phone and ported Sailfish to it, and that ended up spiraling into multi-years of you being involved in the community.
Pretty much, yeah. I think it stems from not wanting to spend loads of money on phones, so I bought myself a cheap phone, probably off eBay, and I think it was a HTC, and ported an early version of Sailfish to that, probably like 1 point something. And then that spiraled into buying another phone, a Chinese Xiaomi phone, porting that, and that becoming quite popular. And then a couple of companies got in touch, like FX Tech, which make quite a popular geek phone because it's got a built-in keyboard, the Pro One, and Voller, which are a German company which make the Voller phone.
And so what, they just sent you the devices and you ported it over?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I'm somewhat envious of you having one of those FX Tech ones. That's the sliding QWERTY. That's what I always used to love about the early Android phones.
I also had a development device which came to a very, very sad ending on a bike ride when it smashed into a lot of pieces.
Oh dear.
But yeah, I'm using the Pro One as my daily phone at the moment. I've also got the development version of the Pro One X, which isn't even out yet.
Oh, right. And is that a similar form factor then?
Yeah, it's almost exactly the same form factor. There wasn't supposed to be a Pro One X, but there was chip shortages and chip changes, so they had to redesign the internals and basically recreate it on a different chipset than what was in the original phone. Right,
I see. So how close to Android is it then? Like, is it using a proper Linux kernel or is it using just the Android kernel?
Depends on the device, I guess. Because there's also the Pine phones, but we could maybe move on to Pine phones later. The devices which start off as Android generally use a lot of the Android middleware, the libraries, the kernel, and then replaces, Sailfish integrates with like the Android system services for hardware communications, like the graphics and the modem and the sensors.
So it's really just the userland stuff that is Sailfish?
Yeah, so it's a whole Linux userland. It's like a normal Linux distribution, but for talking to the hardware, it goes through the Android libraries. Basically, a modified version of the Android system starts up with just the minimal services that it needs to get going.
Right, okay. And so how Linuxy is it then? Can you get a terminal and start doing proper Linux stuff on it?
Yeah, it's a proper Linux. It's just the bits that talk to hardware, which are using Android. So it's SSH. It comes with a terminal by default anyway. So you can do all your Linux. So there's people in the community which are running Debian inside containers, in LXC containers, for example. That's quite big on the Pro one.
Well, I was going to ask about that. What about Docker and stuff? Is that supported?
Docker, I'm not sure, but certainly LXC containers work because that's how Debian and Wadroid work.
Right, I see. And so how is the Android app support these days? Because it's been a while since I've tried it.
From what I gather, the stock Android app support's pretty solid. It's on version 10. I don't think many people have many problems, but because it's proprietary, I don't actually use or have access to that.
Right. Because you have to pay for the proper version of it on some devices, don't you, with the Sony Xperia devices?
Yeah, so you can buy a license for about €50, and that gets it going on the Sony Xperia 10, 10.2, and I think the 10.3 is about to come out.
But the devices you've ported it to then, is it full-on Sailfish?
Yeah, so it's everything that's on Sailfish apart from those proprietary bits, like the Android and the text prediction. But there's another guy in the community who's wrote his own text prediction keyboard, which uses the Presage library, and that's arguably better than the stock text prediction as well.
Right, but you're still using the proprietary UI parts then? Yeah,
so we still have access to all the proprietary UI. It's called the Silica library. It's just Android Exchange and keyboard.
You mentioned the Pine phones. Where are we with those then? Because you may have heard us talk on Linux After Dark about the sort of sorry state. That's a bit of a over-egging the pudding on it, but the state of ARM Linux devices where nothing is quite 100% finished. Where is Sailfish in terms of the original Pine phone and the upcoming Pine phone Pro then?
Yeah, I'd probably agree with you. I did make a joke that, it was end-user ready as long as you had a UART cable to debug the kernel not loading.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It's funny, really. So the original Pine phone in the next version of Sailfish is looking pretty good. So the Pine phone port of Sailfish is completely non-Android. It's completely native Linux with a stock kernel, stock userland using Mesa for its graphics. But that's had its issues within Sailfish being the only device that's been like that. There's a lot of code in Sailfish which assumed that it was running on Android or like on the Android graphics. So things like the web browser didn't work and the email client didn't work because the email client was rendering inside a web engine. Basically, the web engine didn't work. But in the upcoming Sailfish 4.4, that's all been fixed. So the main Sailfish software is all working on the Pine phone and probably the Pine phone Pro, but I've just started on the Pro. The main problem is the modem layer. So using it as a reliable device for making calls isn't really recommended.
Yeah, which is not ideal for a phone. Who did all that work though? Was that you or was that Yola or who did it?
So the main port, I guess you could say, is mostly me with help from other guys. I mean, we share a lot of code, so I try to minimize the work I have to do. So I'll take kernel configs from Postmarket OS, for example, and the Nemo guys might figure out how something works, and I'll take that and bring it all together and release it as an operating system image. Right,
okay, but it sounds like you do agree that things could be better in the Linux ARM space.
Yeah, certainly. One of the problems with the telephony stack is that we use some software called Ophono, which was developed by Intel. And Ophono is great for Sailfish because Yola's worked on it for many years and it works great with the Android modem drivers. But the modem in a Pine phone is nothing like that. So support for that is really just starting.
Did I hear at some point that they got access to the modem because someone guessed the root password because it's essentially running like a tiny Linux system or something?
Yeah, well, there's a guy that writes an open source firmware for the modem, And the modem really is effectively almost an Android device connected via USB internally on the PinePhone. Because that's how I update the firmware. I have to enable ADB and I fast boot flash the firmware. It's just like using a connected Android phone inside your phone.
Right. Wow. So what about the PinePhone Pro then? How's that looking? Is it going to be significantly better as an experience for the end user?
Speed-wise, it's a lot smoother. The original PinePhone is obviously built to a budget, and the Pro is much more fluid. Other than that, the sensors, you're not going to notice a difference, and the modem's exactly the same. It should be a better user experience, being just generally faster and smoother.
But it's not going to be daily drivable anytime soon, is it, realistically, for most people at least?
Probably not for most people, and probably not on Sailfish. We do have calls working in and out. SMSs are being a bit troublesome. Like if you have two-factor authentication, for example, for me for work, when I have to log on to a VPN and get a code, it doesn't even work for that. Yeah,
two-factor over SMS is always the best, most secure option, eh?
Yeah.
But sometimes that's all you've got, so...
Well, the alternative is to install a Microsoft app, so...
Oh, right. I thought you were going to say a Google app, but it's probably even worse than that. But these devices are going to remain hobbyist then for the foreseeable?
Well, I don't want to talk for the other distros. I imagine maybe give it a year. There's been a reasonable amount of interest on the PinePhone and with Sailfish, so I'd like to think we can iron out the telephony bugs.
All right, well, we'll see, I suppose. We'll see. Because Sailfish on the Xperia devices is a rock solid. I mean, people are paying for it, so they wouldn't keep paying for it if it was bad, surely.
Yeah, and my own devices I've got a reasonable reputation for being pretty solid. There's communities on Telegram and Discord that use Sailfish on the FX Tech Pro and the Volophone, so they're reasonably daily drivable.
Is there any pressure on Yola to open source everything then? I mean, there must be some, but is it ever going to happen, or is that just fantasy?
You do occasionally see people complaining on forums about things not being open source, and I've even had people almost attack me on Twitter about using such software, and how could I? And I'm just like, well, I'm not forcing you to use anything. You're quite welcome to use whatever you want.
Well, it was bad enough when I found an AOSP image for the PinePhone and posted some photos of it. And I got, well, I wouldn't say attacked, but I got some stick at least from people on Twitter, like, why are you doing it? This is supposed to be a Linux phone, not Android. So I can imagine.
Quite interesting. The PinePhone Pro, when you first turn it on, comes with Linux on.
Yeah, it's like just a factory test image to make sure all the sensors and everything are working. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't want to drag politics into this, but I think given the timing of the recording and release of this episode, we have to at least touch on this briefly. One of Yola's biggest customer bases is in Russia. And before we started talking, you said that Yola have released a statement about that recently. I know you don't talk for them, you're just a community member, but like I said, we have to briefly touch on it.
Yeah, so I definitely do not speak for Yola. I'm just a hobbyist, an enthusiastic hobbyist that contributes. And there was obviously other people in the community brought this up on the forums. They asked for a statement to be made by Yola on things happening in Russia and Ukraine. And then earlier today, possibly like last night or early in the morning, there was a statement from an account which said that there was less input from Russia, and it was an entirely mainly European project, and things like that. The weird thing was that the account was brand new, so there was a bit of a discussion about whether or not that was like trolling. But the account itself has got like almost admin privileges, so that's seen as being from Yola.
All right, well, we'll link to that in the show notes. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Adam. It's been really enlightening. As I said, I've had great experiences with Sailfish in the past. I hope you managed to get it working really well on the PinePhone Pro and future devices. I look forward to talking to you again at some point, maybe.
Yeah, of course. What would make you move back to Sailfish, Joe?
That's a very good question. I think it would have to be Android going so far downhill that I couldn't use it daily anymore. And I think that is relatively unlikely anytime soon.
Okay, maybe in the future though.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. So if people want to find out more about you and your efforts, where's the best place? Twitter or?
Yeah, I generally kind of tweet pictures and videos of things. So it's at Adam Pigg on Twitter.
That's Pig with 2 Gs.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well then. So, yeah, thanks, man, and speak to you soon.
Bill, thank you very much.